Tonight, a charge against the Canadian government for hampering the formation of Indigenous Tribal Police Forces and demanding better funding. And two former Middle Eastern rivals shake hands in Beijing after burying the hatchet, and with renewed promises of growth and stability in the region. Later in the show, a recap of a recent parliamentary meeting in Ottawa on how Canada can combat Islamophobia at home and abroad.
The overwhelming response that we received was positive for this meeting, and we didn't receive negative feedback in terms of organizing the event itself.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening. This is Muslim News Canada on Muslim Network TV. I'm Catherine Bullock. In a developing story, China and the United Arab Emirates are calling for a closed-door meeting of the United Nations Security Council to discuss the constant raiding by Israeli forces on the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. The news comes after Israeli forces raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque for the second time. They fired rubber bullets and stun grenades at hundreds of worshippers present in the mosque. 6 people were wounded in the rampage. The night before, Israeli forces arrested more than 400 Palestinians, injuring hundreds of others. The Arab League, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia have all condemned the raids, saying they endanger regional stability. The Indigenous Police Chiefs of Ontario, or IPCO, has filed charges against the Canadian government for hampering the formation of tribal police forces and underfunding their work. This comes after a stabbing rampage on Labor Day in September last year left 10 dead and 18 wounded in a First Nations community in Saskatchewan. There was no Indigenous police force in the community, and it took hours for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to respond to the scene. While the government had promised to bring legislation to address this in the fall, yesterday a government spokesperson was unable to give a date by which the legislation would be tabled. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, says his spokesperson, strongly condemns the Taliban's decision to ban Afghan women from working with the global body in Afghanistan. The Secretary-General is calling on the Taliban to revoke the decision to stop women from working. He says female staff members are essential to UN operations, including the delivery of life-saving assistance. Guterres says, quote, "If enforced, this decision will harm the Afghan people, millions of whom are in need of such assistance." The Taliban's return to power has deprived women and girls of their rights, including the right to education and work. Top diplomats from Iran and Saudi Arabia met today in Beijing, pledging to work together to bring security and stability to the region following a surprise reconciliation brokered by China. In a joint statement released after talks between Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdullahian and Saudi Prince Faisal bin Farhan, the two sides vowed to continue to work together to improve ties. The two countries broke ties 7 years ago after protesters in Iran attacked Saudi diplomatic missions. The minister's visit to Beijing comes at the same time as the French president and the EU chief were also in the Chinese capital to talk about the Ukraine war. Please stay tuned. We will join you after a short break.
Assalamu alaikum and Ramadan Mubarak. I'm here to ask you to support something which we are watching right now, Muslim Network Television. Just like PBS, NPR, or even your masjid, we depend on your donations. We broadcast Muslims, we put Muslims on air. We bring good news. We counter negative media with positive media. And here is an example. When the terrible earthquakes hit Turkey and Syria, Muslim Americans donated $100 million within 5 days. That was more than what US government gave in the same time. Getting our news out is what Muslim Network does. This Ramadan, stand for your community. Donate to Muslim Network. Do it now. Visit muslimnetworktv. Thank you so much, and assalamu alaikum.
March 15th was the United Nations International Day to Combat Islamophobia. Justice for All Canada, with partners the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, hosted a parliamentary briefing to focus attention on the relationship between Islamophobia and genocide, amongst other things. Justice for All Canada's human rights policy expert, Diadon Alexio, joins us now to talk about how the parliamentarians viewed their main message. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. A regular from Justice for All Canada, a sister organisation to us at Muslim Network TV. Let's start with the Basics 101. You had a parliamentary briefing, but what is a parliamentary briefing?
So Justice for All, as Justice for All Canada, we're very proud of hosting this event. This was the first of its nature, an in-person parliamentary briefing, as you mentioned, to commemorate the United Nations Global Islamophobia Day on March 15th. And really the purpose of this briefing was to highlight Islamophobia and its effects both domestically and globally. And we had a number of different speakers and human rights activists there and a number of politicians from different parties in attendance to learn more about Islamophobia and how we may combat it. And as you mentioned, it was...
We'll come back to who was there and what your message was, but I just want to backtrack a little in case somebody's watching, they don't know what a parliamentary briefing is and how do you put one together. So let's just do a little bit of 101 there. What's a parliamentary briefing and how do you organize it?
Well, it was a bit fluid and dynamic. We selected human rights advocates who are leaders in the community to come together, who are experts on their fields, from different fields, to present to the parliamentarians to educate them about this. And so there was a selection process who we might select, and we invited all MPs and senators to come to the briefing. And really, it was just about emceeing the event and making sure it runs fluidly.
Mm-hmm. And can anyone just go into Parliament and invite parliamentarians? Did it take place in the Parliament building?
This event took place across the Parliament building at the Valor building. So it's sort of a meeting place where parliamentarians can come. And some certain members of the community were in attendance. However, it was a bit more of a closed-off meeting in the sense that it wasn't open to the public necessarily. So it was a bit more intimate where we could discuss these issues directly to the politicians in attendance.
So you mentioned that you invited several different organizations who have a focus on human rights. Was there a common message that the presentations were giving?
Yes, there was. It's the impact that Islamophobia is having on Muslims. We had this common message to commemorate the United Nations Global Islamophobia Day. However, the message was tailored based on the activists themselves. So certain activists focused on Islamophobia here in Canada, the effects that it's had, and certain activists focused on global Islamophobia, whether it's their personal experience or what they have researched in this regard.
We don't have time to go through one by one, but do you want to just share a memorable moment that somebody shared in their presentation?
I would say Brother Qayyum Masimov, who is from the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project. He shared a heart-touching story about some of his own family members who are being persecuted in China. And I think his contribution, both emceeing and sharing his personal story, was very valuable. And this speaks to what we were talking about earlier about the diversity of activists. Some activists have done research in the area. Some activists have personal stories. Actually, quite many of them have personal stories. So for me, that account was very memorable.
And what about yourself in your presentation? What was your main message?
My main message was about global Islamophobia and how it affects Muslims in the countries we had spoken about in our last interview, which is China, Burma, the Central African Republic, and India. And this was I was supporting Brother Qayyum, who also spoke about the Uyghurs. And our recent global Islamophobia report, which has been published on Justice for All Canada, was outlining what is in that report and the recommendations.
When Parliament got together a few years ago to debate a motion put forward by MP Iqra Khalid called M103 to condemn Islamophobia and other forms of discrimination, there was a huge backlash from many different political players in Canada. When you organise a parliamentary briefing on Islamophobia, did you also receive backlash from other community groups or parliamentarians themselves saying they didn't want to attend this kind of thing?
I would say overwhelmingly our response that we received was positive. However, I would say perhaps some members may have. That's what I would say. The overwhelming response that we received was positive for this meeting, and we didn't receive negative feedback in terms of organizing the event itself.
So who was there then? Who accepted your invitation?
So we're very proud that we had a number of parliamentarians from different parties. So I may mention some names. We had honorable members, MP Salma Zahid, who was also a speaker, MP Rob Oliphant, MP Peter Julian, who's the House Leader of the NDP, MP Samir Zubairi, and MP Ikra Khalid, whom you mentioned as well as senators. So Senator Mary Coyle and Senator Margot Greenwood.
I don't know if you had a chance to mingle and socialize, but what were they telling you about the information that they'd heard?
Generally, their response was positive, and they were happy to hear the diverse experiences that we shared. And I think what's also important is that we formed the relationship with the parliamentarians, and that these meetings will be ongoing on how we can continue to work to combat Islamophobia. Yes.
Canadians are sometimes proud that Canada had passed a motion condemning what's happening to the Uyghurs as genocide, but Prime Minister Trudeau and his cabinet abstained from that vote. So when you speak to the Liberal MPs, how do you kind of address that absence of their voice in that decision?
Yes, it's definitely a sensitive relationship. We do know that the House of Commons recognized what's going on with the Uyghurs as a genocide. It wasn't formally recognized by the Senate, and as you mentioned, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and certain other members abstained from the vote. It's definitely a sensitive relationship, and there's many factors that come into it. I believe some members cited that the relationship with China. However, we say that this is not necessarily an excuse, and we would like to push forward in recognizing genocide where it is occurring, because this does trigger the legal obligations under that. And we do not shy away from calling genocide what it is, and we hope that the parliamentarians in attendance and who receive our message also can receive this message as well.
And what were offered then as the next steps, like concrete steps to address the issues that you raised?
Central to the theme of what we recommended and the message we wanted to get across is that Islamophobia is behind these different discriminations for Muslims, both in Canada and across the globe. Our domestic activists and partners recommended that all levels of government be involved and involve Muslim voices in both combating legislation that has already been passed and also passing legislation to target hate crimes have occurred in Canada. And globally, we reiterated the recommendations which we had spoke about last time. For example, passing Magnitsky Act sanctions or mobilizing the international community to hold governments and individuals accountable who have been responsible for genocide.
You mentioned Magnitsky Act. I can't pronounce that word properly. Just remind us what that is.
Magnitsky Act sanctions are essentially for governments to blacklist individuals who have been responsible for human rights abuses, and they have similar legislation in both Canada and the United States. It originated from an individual named Sergei Magnitsky, who was persecuted, and so this legislation was passed. The Canadian government has already listed a number of people to be sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act regulations. So we would like to see further leaders who are responsible for human rights abuse to this list, which would then, for example, freeze their assets or blacklist them.
And did Justice for All Canada get a commitment from those in attendance, or even those who may have wanted to attend but couldn't, that they would attend? Is this going to become like a monthly event or any kind of regular meeting?
So inshallah, God willing, this will be a regular type of meeting. There are some meeting schedules in the month.
And it looks like we might have technical issues there, so we'll just wrap it up now. Thank you for watching. We need your support for donations. please go to our website, muslimnetworktv, and make a donation or scan the QR code on the broadcast so that we can continue to amplify the voices of Muslims in Canada and abroad. Assalamu alaikum.